Okay, I've hit the record button. There we go. That's it. That's a start. Look, we've been having I'm going to call it a pre-show already, discussing about remote work and the rest of it. So we can keep talking about that. But Ben, Jared, everybody else for joining us, thanks very much. This is office hours, and I guess it's open.
Yeah, feel free to ask questions either spoken or in the chat. What's on people's minds? Have people been attending the final week of reInvent? I haven't seen much discussion on Twitter, so my assumption is not really.
I would like to know why reInvent is so long now, and how can I make it stop?
Yeah.
Please.
I mean, it was long
when it was a
before.
week.
It just was, you only had to be in person for one of those weeks. It definitely ate up 3 solid weeks of my time.
Well, yes, but I feel like it used to be compressed. So there was like a limit.
Yep.
And now we're just into like, in 2020/2021 fashion, a reInvent that just extends until the next reInvent.
Yeah. Well, and
at which point, why do you have reInvent? You could just call it a regular day.
And it's one of those things where the lack of physical presence, which enforces certain things, right? That it's much easier for me to decide that I'm going to kind of do reInvent and kind of do real work. And both of them are going to be worse because of it. Whereas when I'm there in person, I don't have that choice. Which is, you know, I'm excited to see next year that some of the advantages to a virtual conference might be brought to an in-person reInvent. So live streaming more of the content to people who aren't in person, or getting it out sooner, or any of those kind of things. But so much of the things that made reInvent valuable, I think, are lost in at least how reInvent was done virtually this year.
I have to believe
recordings really nice.
Go ahead, Ryan.
What's that?
Same week recordings are extremely nice.
Yes, but that was happening last year anyway. Right?
Yeah, but I feel like it wasn't as consistent.
It wasn't as consistent, certainly, because it didn't have to be, right?
Well, also like the audio quality on the recorded versions, much better for sure. But yeah, this kind of trailer 2 weeks, I just cannot understand who greenlit that.
Yeah.
I would love to understand, but I cannot.
My guess is that,
well, the content is pre-produced, right?
Exactly, and they ended up getting more content than maybe they knew where to put, so they had to put it somewhere. So I mean, I don't know. Is this week actually reInvent? I don't know. It's an overflow week, and it's quality stuff, but it's How
iRobot uses Kubernetes.
Everybody?
We do not have any. Ha.
We do.
Hey, Wayne, you got something? You got a question? Oh, you're saying you use Kubernetes?
Yeah, we do, except we're using Google Cloud Platform for Kubernetes.
Yeah, reasonable thing.
Just because I think they obviously are the leader. They had the best product at the time, and I mean, don't get me wrong, it's been a struggle, but I think it's also a good decision long term. It's just that it's a huge learning curve from doing anything that you used to on EC2.
Yep, and it's a step in the right direction, right?
Yeah.
So I have some follow-up, just very briefly. Last time that we did one of these, we talked about CloudShell, because I guess CloudShell had just dropped, and you know, I don't know if I could say that we were excited about it, but like, it's a thing. I'll follow up and say that I have not used it at all since then. But we did have a conversation about Cloud9, or Cloud9 popped up in conversation. And I have to say, I have been using Cloud9 since then, just to sort of refamiliarize myself with it. I actually really like it. I think that for a particular kind of person, I think it works quite well.
Well, we also have a longtime expert Cloud9 user. here, and Jared Short.
I wanted to find out.
Wrote,
I wanted to pick your brains on this.
An article. How long ago was that? It was a long time ago.
Oh, probably 2.5 or 3 years ago now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it was 17, 18.
I get a new developer machine every day.
Yep.
And just how with Cloud9, you can never have cruft build up in your environment because you can make it go away.
Yep.
You want to talk a bit more about what you like and don't like about Cloud9, Jared?
What is your provisioning process for that on a daily basis? Sorry to interrupt with a question.
No. That's a good question. I did a couple things. Actually, I stole some from Ryan Scott Brown, which is on here, but I effectively used a really simple like bash script and then some brew stuff around it. And then I used Ansible Vault actually for some secret stuff to grab the secrets and decrypt. But really the crux of it all is effectively just dot files, right? Like as long as you can ship dot files around, and then have it install some really simple stuff with brew or what have you, was fairly elegant. My machine, then I would just go into Cloud9 and I had essentially a copy paste actually stored in my 1Password. Copy paste that command in, which had my decrypt key in there, and then everything else would just scaffold out from that. So could have been better, I'm sure. But what was nice about it was I actually would do multiple of those a day. Anytime I went to work on a different client's machine project or a different project in general, I just had a new Cloud9 for that, right? So the blast radius was completely limited. It also had the interesting side effect of multiple AWS account access, right?
Yep. You were working with Track 10 at the time.
I was working with Track 10 at the time.
So you had multiple clients to...
Yep. So I had multiple clients, and then, I didn't have to worry about my Python getting blown up because I was doing something for somebody else.
Does that mean that you were running a different Cloud9 instance always in the customer account, or were you using a central account where you were running that and then using assume roles and things like that to go to those accounts?
Yep, I used the central account for that. And what was really interesting about it was I had to figure out how to make Cloud9 work with a VPN, because the only way when I was at Track 10, the only way we could get access to clients' accounts was to get temporary credentials via assume role access, which had to come through our VPN. There's some interesting limitations there. So eventually I had to figure out how to whitelist AWS IP addresses because of how Cloud9, basically I had to whitelist AWS IP addresses to not tunnel through the VPN, because there was some interesting limitations with the internet connection needing to go from Cloud9 has CloudFront in front of their Cloud9 service. And to get to the instances, there was some networking stuff. I don't remember all of it because it was years ago, but basically I learned way more about the AWS IP ranges than I needed to. I learned more about the IP ranges yesterday too. Ben Kehoe saw that, but... which we can talk about that later.
I was going to talk about the difficulties of putting things behind CloudFront and then wanting to use a VPN with that and having to tell everything that's like Netflix and things like that also through that VPN. But I'm actually more interested in what you learned about the IP ranges.
So something fun we learned I think 2 days ago, maybe 3 days ago, we were using synthetics, CloudWatch synthetics and the Canaries to check our APIs. We're doing some certain things with APIs and our website and things like that. And for whatever reason, every now and then we would just get like various errors back in our Canaries, and we could never find them. Like the Canary would come back and say, hey, we have a 429 or a 403 or a 500 or whatever, and we could never exactly figure out why. And we'd always go to our logs for those services, and we'd never see any logs. There would never be logs for those requests. Turns out the underlying Lambda functions that were being used by Canary were getting blocked by AWS WAF as malicious IP addresses. So AWS was assigning IP addresses that were considered malicious to these Lambda functions that they were blocking themselves. And it took us forever to figure that out. We had to work with AWS support. They were great for it, but we thought that was hilarious.
It is. I saw some questions in the chat. Ian arrived, and I know he did some cool things with Canaries when those first came out. To looking at what they actually did behind the scenes.
So, Jared, where on the shared responsibility model does that fall?
I have no idea, because they told us, well, run it in a VPC, and we said the only VPC that exists at Steady is not going to be for Canaries. So
it also doesn't solve the problem. They're handing out those IPs.
If you put it in a VPC and a subnet, you can pick those IPs, right? You can sign it like an EIP.
Well, it depends on, but if you're going out through an internet gateway or an NAT gateway, the IP for that NAT gateway could still come from that block.
Theoretically, yes.
Now
but you would be able to like
the
keep
number
it
of IPs that you would need.
Yep.
But the point is that they're handing out IPs that are in this malicious list out to things inside AWS. And so, yeah, it could get handed out to anything. There's no reason that it would have to be Lambda in particular.
Yep. Yeah, but anyways, that was our fun discovery.
So, Jared, are you using Cloud9 still?
No, for a very specific reason, and that was last I checked, the TypeScript support was not solid. I'm hoping it's different by now.
Right.
But one of the biggest limitations of Cloud9, and it might have been in the article, I don't remember, but if you're doing anything interesting in terms of linting or language support or things like that, plugins, you're super limited.
Yeah.
Well, that's why it's really surprised me that they haven't enabled it as a VS Code remote.
Yes. I think people have made stuff around that, right?
Sure, but it should just be a thing that works, right?
Yeah. Yep.
No, I was going to say plugin support does seem to be the big thing that's missing. And it is something that was there in like a beta phase before AWS bought it. Am I right? Durga, I'm going to have to mute you, I think. There you go.
Yep.
Thank you.
What was that? Sorry.
I think the plugin support was on its way before AWS picked it up and consumed it, and then it doesn't seem to have gone anywhere. But
yeah,
that's the one thing that's missing. But hey, for me, because I'm not a developer, I will tell everybody that until I'm blue in the face. I'm not a developer. I'm nowhere near good enough for that. But to write scripts, to do scripting, and to like just bash together Lambda functions for like integration bits and pieces, it's pretty good. And being able to do like the single-click deployments or 3-click deployments of a Lambda function into Lambda environment in a testing environment. Please don't use it for production deployments. It's great. I love it. Anyway,
the other thing that it was super useful for me was if you're on an airplane or you're on an iPad, and I think Corey, correct me if I'm wrong, I think Corey uses Cloud9 from his iPad. I could be wrong.
Briefly, and then CodeSpaces got good.
Okay, that's fair. The biggest thing for me was I can have a solid connection from Cloud9 to whatever I need, and a crappy connection from my local machine to Cloud9. Sure. And it pretty much hides those problems, right? So if you're on an airplane, you can still download Docker containers at hundreds of megabits per second, things like that. That was the really useful parts for me, especially when I was traveling a whole lot. That was like critical. Just hotspot on my phone, and most of my data usage is still the Cloud9 instance to the internet and not my local machine.
Yeah, for sure. Nice.
Yeah, I wrote the Cloud9 a Cloud9 extension for VS Code that does the cursor sync and everything else, but I had to do that by just purely reverse engineering this WebSocket connection, and it was a huge mess. And then I had to deal with conflicts when two parties try and override the same thing, and it turned into a mess. So I get the challenges behind that.
For sure. Hey, Ben, are you back with us? Did you fall out of the room? Ben?
Yes, I'm back.
Ah, cool.
Just having connectivity issues, I think.
Should use Cloud9, obviously.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. What next? Anyone got any burning questions?
I'm interested in Ben's experience with AWS IoT. So, as some background, I work at Redbox, and obviously we've got these kiosks all across the US, and it's a really great use case for IoT.
Sure.
And I'm just interested to know what your lessons were, things not to do, best practices.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the complexity, especially initially, is figuring out how you're going to do authentication. So in other words, who's building these boxes for you? How are they getting the certificates? So with AWS IoT, instead of having an identity that's based around a access key ID, secret access key, instead you use X509 certificates and use mutual TLS authentication as the way that you're connecting to the cloud. So that means that the certificate has to be understood by AWS in one of a number of ways. So one way is that the certificates can actually be provisioned by AWS. So you go into AWS and you say, give me a certificate, and it gives you a cert and a private key, and you put that on your device. And another way is that you can register a certificate to say, here's a certificate that I have, recognize this. The other way is that you can have a CA certificate, so a certificate authority that you're installing, and you're telling IoT that you want to trust devices that come in with that certificate authority signature on their cert. So what that allows you to do is configure IoT once to say, here's my certificate authority. And then completely separate from that, without communicating with AWS, you can create as many certs as you want. Just when you create them, you create a signature from your CA. And then when they connect to the cloud, they say, hey, look, here's my identity. And by the way, I've got a signature from the CA, so you should let me in, right? Because the CA said I was okay. Now, I'm also aware that some companies that use AWS IoT use like a single certificate for all of their devices. That's not the way that I would like to do it. I'd like to have separate identity, separate cryptographic materials per device. Just because that means compromise of any given credentials is not then impacting your entire fleet, any of those kind of things. So once you have that, right, so that's how you connect. And then you get this pub sub system inside AWS IoT, which allows you to have an always-on bidirectional communication down with the device. And that can just be used for message passing. That's a MQTT broker that's partially compliant to the MQTT 3.1 spec. There are aspects of it that it doesn't implement. And then that you can subscribe onto that using IoT rules and pass messages out. You match messages, and you get to pass that out to a Lambda function or a Kinesis stream or whatever you want beyond IoT. The additional thing that it provides inside IoT core, inside the message broker, is a thing called a shadow, which is sort of a way for asynchronous communication with the device. So if communication is spotty, instead of needing to know that you published a message and it received it, you have essentially a place where you can say, hey, device, I have something I want to talk to you about. I'll put it here, and then you can come retrieve that later. So those are those pieces. And then beyond IoT core, which is about the messaging and the authentication and such, there's a whole suite of tools for indexing those shadows and jobs for taking action on stuff and analytics for doing time series. And then a whole, and then a whole suite of things that are more useful for industrial IoT that I don't really understand or know about because I deal with consumer IoT. Right, in consumer IoT, you don't get to send like a technician out to go fix something. And the number of devices you have tends to be extremely high. And so there are things that just don't make sense to do in terms of the amount of telemetry and the things that you're doing on the device, those kind of things. And so these things like IoT site-wise and things like this are just stuff that I don't really have a lot of knowledge about. But there's definitely a pretty comprehensive suite of tools for doing IoT related things.
The other big one that Ben didn't touch on was green grass, which depending on how much compute power you have available to you, especially on, I would assume like Redbox kiosk would have a decent amount. Greengrass introduces some pretty elegant deployment models and some other nice functionality where you can start deploying effectively to your devices like their Lambda with some caveats. But
especially if you have more cloud-like developers than device-like developers, it can be really useful because you're writing like Lambda code in a language for Lambda rather than embedded C++ code.
Yep.
On the other hand, if you have developers who are expert on the on-device stuff and don't really know much about cloud, it's kind of the opposite. There's stuff that they're going to have to learn just to get using it.
You can probably have a bit of a hybrid between the two. You can have those on-device libraries and core bits of functionality that the device can do. But absolutely, Greengrass is going to give you the ability to have those developer teams push out code directly through pipelines without having to get up and visit a box.
Yeah, well, what you lose there is the deployment model. If you're in hybrid, you lose a lot of the advantages of the Greengrass deployment model. And I think you can package code. There's stuff you can do with Greengrass. The other thing that Greengrass does that I don't think is applicable for Redbox is that if you have a set of devices, each of which does not need its own connection to the cloud, and you only need a gateway, Greengrass can help a lot with that. So if you think about in my mind, like in a manufacturing facility, you have an assembly line, and you have dozens of devices along the assembly line that are going to be collecting telemetry and doing various things. And you all want all of that information, but you don't need each of them to have their own connection up to the cloud. So you have one Greengrass gateway and many Greengrass devices. I can't remember exactly their terminology. But essentially, you have one place where there's a connection to the cloud, and then there's a local MQTT network that all these devices can participate in. And you're paying per connection rather than per device. So if you have, 30 of these devices that are all connected to this one Greengrass gateway, you're only paying for the one gateway.
So I played with VPC Reachability Analyzer when it came out, but it piqued my interest today because Chris Munn's posted about it. And I'm wondering if someone has a good explain like a 5 or 10 explanation of how that actually works, because I know it uses automated reasoning on the back end.
So I don't think they've talked publicly about how the VPC analyzer works, but they have talked in reasonable detail about how the IAM access analyzer works, which is built on the same technology. And so it essentially says, right, I've got a list of sort of conditions in my policy, whether it's your security groups or your IAM policies, and what are the situations in which this policy can go in one direction or the other. And they start partitioning it out so that then they can figure out what are all the cases that this policy would use, and then go see if any of those conditions are true or false. And I'll see if I can dig up that video.
Yeah, are you talking about the reInvent? I think it was reInvent 2019, the Zelkova talk.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a very good kind of explanation. But the access analyzer, extends that with knowledge about all of the different firewall rules and VPC routing. And I think it supports transit gateway routing. I think it didn't at launch, but now does. And builds all of that translates your settings into what, an IAM would be, a policy or a series of policies, and then checks reachability from all these different places. And it's really cool, like really nice. I've been working in networking for a really long time, and this is kind of the first time that that's been available as something you can just plug and play. Previously everything is like make a Visio diagram and trace it with a pencil, and other equally useless types of automation where you can do it once, and then once you've forgotten about it, you're never going to be able to reproduce kind of that same result without having the same people in the room. So it's pretty slick.
So can I ask then, so is it actually an exhaustive search of the available routes given a set of rules? Because I thought that when I looked at it shortly after the announcement, it was essentially from point A to point B, is it working? And if it's not working, why is it not working?
No, that's the thing. Yep.
Yeah, the way that it shows it is the point A to point B, but under the hood, the way Zelkova works is it will give you the exhaustive set. But for most humans, that's not helpful, because usually humans are asking, why is this specific track unavailable? Or is my S3 bucket available to anyone in public, right? So humans have these questions that are much less exhaustive than, the Zelkova answer usually.
So I disagree that it's actually the exhaustive set. It is a model that allows you to answer those individual questions, I think.
In the Zelkova talk, I thought they showed it produces, like, given all of the set of possible inputs, it produces like a set notation of here's all the inputs that would give access.
It produces, you're asking for the set of conditions that would be true for access to result. But you're still asking sort of a point question about a given condition, rather than it producing literally it's not enumerating, it's building a model of which you can ask questions. And one of the questions you can ask is, if this if this thing is outside of, if this condition is false, right? That the principal or the resource is outside of the account, right? Which does that result in an approve from the policy?
So then how does Access Analyzer give you the interesting, I guess it must ask a bunch of preset questions and then just put them in a table.
Right, because cross-account access is, I think, relatively straightforward in terms of, which is why it's easier to talk about the cross-account access than it is to talk about all the access that's provided inside the account. Because you're sort of asking about relatively clear situations.
Just to be clear, though, we're talking about, so you've got IAM Access Analyzer, you've got VPC Access Analyzer, like whilst they might share an underlying methodology, they are different things, right?
They're built on the same technology, which deals with taking a set of rules and being able to answer questions about that set of rules.
Yeah.
So Ian just said AWS shouldn't prop up Zelkova as a magic perfect technology because it has false certainty. I'm curious, Ian, if you can put you mentioned side channels. Is there like an example that you can make that more concrete for us?
Yeah, sure. So last year I did the Security September series. One of the things that came out of that was CloudFormation having its own direct APIs for things like S3 tagging. right? So, and that wasn't being applied through the IAM policies. It was a sort of a side channel for that, because CloudFormation needs to, my assumption is that CloudFormation needs to basically have a dedicated API that they use for applying the AWS : prefixed tags, which you can't do that through the public API. So the tagging, even a deny on, like explicit deny on publicly tagging buckets wouldn't be effective in that case. So that's the kind of thing that Zelkova should be checking for, but didn't because there's another way around it.
Now, what you're saying is a deny on tagging. When you create something without tags, CloudFormation will still put those tags on the AWS CloudFormation tags on it for you.
Yes, and that was a bug it was a security issue that I reported and it got fixed. But what I'm trying to say is that that's the sort of thing that Zelkova should pick up, but it didn't because it never took that route. I agree that it is, mathematically proper if it actually gets executed, but side channels do exist. And I don't think this idea of absolutely perfect protection exists.
Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be a limit of, Zelkova builds a model of the system and all of the routes through it. And so if it's missing routes, then it's not going to work. So like I was saying about the not supporting cross-region transit gateway, it's not going to understand your reachability if you have a cross-region transit gateway, because Zelkova, or the Zelkova model of it, doesn't understand that. So, it can't work, right?
Or, for example, if you have private link endpoints, which VPC Analyzer will know about, but if there's one private link that allows you to communicate outside of it to another VPC, right? You have a channel in which you can communicate between two VPCs that's not going to show up in reachability. And I think the underlying issue is twofold. One is that the Zelkova piece doesn't actually have any understanding of the routes through the system. It only has an understanding of the policy. And it only has an understanding, so that's one piece. And the other thing is that it only has an understanding of the policy, as much of the policy as has been put into the Zelkova analyzer at the time, right? Which is the thing that I think people mentioned about it didn't initially have all of the ways, didn't initially maybe have transit gateway or something like that. And so there are things that it just doesn't, that parts of the policy that it doesn't know about or understand, and those are going to be missed out. And then there's the implementation, the real world implementation, which, like Ian was saying, the policy says that shouldn't happen. And Zelkova doesn't have any way of recognizing that the policy is not followed to the letter by the instantiated system. And I don't think has a way of actually modeling that. So I completely agree with Ian that it should not be understood as when it says this access does not exist, you should not trust it. When it says this access does exist, you should trust it. Right? It gives you some confidence. If it says no, that can't be done, you should be like, well, it's probably at least hard. Yeah, it's only the times when it says, yeah, I can get there, that you should understand it as giving you certainty.
And even then, maybe not because of on-host firewalls.
It's true.
But yeah.
True.
I think there's also, a good remark there from Scott that it's not only about what it can show, but also how it frames that. Well, I'm rephrasing what he said. He said that usually with reachability, you don't really care about how reachable it is, but you want to know, is it some way exposed to the public or not? And there are two sides of that. On one end, and that's especially true for reachability analyzer, you want to be able to say that and to see that, especially if it's public. on the other end, I think that also ties very much into the proving the negative, because I think it was also Scott that looked at using S3 policies with IP addresses in the conditions, and then if you put every IP address in there, then it will show it as public. But if you leave out like, I don't know, 3 IP addresses or like one subnet, then it will say, oh, this is not technically public. So it will show it as not public, even though like half of the internet can reach it.
Yeah, so it used to, and I haven't checked if this is true or not anymore, but it used to work non-deterministically, and so you could give it a /1 IP address to, and within your conditions to basically say allow anything from this /1, which is going to be half the internet, 50% of the internet, and sorry, my dog is scratching himself. Sorry. And anyways, so you could try and click, like I would like to create this policy, and S3 public block access would, sometimes deny it and sometimes allow it. And so you just keep clicking, like try and create this policy, try and create it. And eventually it would just go through because it worked non-deterministically. And I think it was because of the automated reasoning behind the scenes. What it does is it basically is asking a whole bunch of questions. And so it would randomly pick a public IP address and say, hey, is this IP address accessible to it? And it would just, every time you tried to create the policy, would randomly pick a new one. And so that non-determinism was causing that problem.
Interesting. Yeah, okay. Defining what the public internet is a little bit hard sometimes in these things, right?
Yeah, and at the same time, like you don't really want to have it be deterministic, because then, and I mean, you could probably test it now to see like what is the magic IP address that you cannot have in your policy to be allowed. And then as long as you don't include that, now you can make a public S3 bucket as long as there's a deny for that one IP address.
Well, you want it to be deterministic. You just want it to be actually, is it reachable by the internet, right?
So you want it to probably change what that, what the definition of public is. Like, is 50% of the internet, does that count as public? Like /1, how should we define what is public?
Yeah.
It's an interesting thing to figure out which IP you have to pick, because you cannot use any IP that's in use by your user themselves, because that might be that one IP that they're going to put in there as that's the only one allowed, and in that case you should show that's not public. So it's definitely an interesting problem to solve that.
Does the policy simulator also use Zelkova on the back?
No, that doesn't.
That doesn't. Okay.
Because the policy sim has existed since 2015, at least.
Still without an API.
What?
Still without an API?
It has one, I think.
I don't know if it does.
That's a great question, but I do know that it's been around for a really long time. So unless, Zelkova has been secretly around for much, much, much longer, but I really doubt it has, because I've also seen, edge cases in the policy simulator. So if you use the policy simulator that doesn't use the roles in your account and you just do the generic one, it won't handle like conditionals correctly. So this policy sim isn't a source of proof either. Oh, there is an API for it.
Where is it?
Scott Piper's AWS IoT simulate custom policy. That's slick. But yeah, the policy simulator is also a really nice tool with certain limits.
A lot of limits. Like you have to include, if your policy is including type of keys or anything like that, you have to specify when you make the call what those keys, the values of those keys should be. So
yeah. So you need to like CloudTrail to find the values of each key, and then like it's
I hate
if
it.
they are in CloudTrail, because that's not guaranteed either.
I was waiting for someone to say that.
And you wait about 15 minutes for those trails to populate.
Is everything in CloudTrail these days? Because that's always been the thing. Like there's so many times, the things, that you don't necessarily see it written down, but the people say everything will be in CloudTrail, and I'm sitting in the background going, no, not really.
Almost everything.
Almost everything.
No, actually, Olaf found some really interesting stuff. I think we found there's like root account actions that happen that don't show up.
Oh,
in
does doing
CloudTrail.
stuff like changing support level show up?
I don't think so. Another one that we run into that doesn't show up is disabling the STS endpoints in regions, which is something that you shouldn't do at any point. Like it doesn't do what you think it does, so you should leave them enabled anyway. But if someone would think, oh, disabling an STS endpoint is a good idea, I'm going to do that, you need to do that with a root account, I think. It might be able with an IAM admin account. I'm not 100% sure. I think it's even with an admin account you can do it. It's not logged anywhere, so you cannot see what happened there.
What's the other things we found, Olaf? Was it like AWS SSO assume role activities were not logged?
AWS SSO.
Well, they're logged, but what happened is we tried to catch them off EventBridge, and then
that's right.
Forwarded. So none of the assume role or assume role with SAML events got forwarded to EventBridge. And we spent like hours looking for those.
Oh, wait.
Yeah, the stuff that shows up in CloudTrail that you think should go to EventBridge.
You're saying
there was a bug though
that happens inside the destination account during AWS SSO authentication. So
exactly.
On the management side of it, the create permission set does not include all the parameters. In particular, it does not include the policies or the inline policy in the event. So you can't actually see what permission set was created. A create account assignment is also not in there.
Right. We were looking for the events when somebody actually initiates a setting, and then somewhere under the cover should be doing a assume role with SAML. Our scenario was one in which we wanted to alert on certain roles being used.
Yep.
And then that's a really useful thing. What we ended up doing, of course, is just piping through all the events and then grouping them by principal or session ID, and then figuring out which role was used. But yeah, they told me we created a support case for it, and they told me they had like previous requests. One of them ended up being from a colleague. And at some point they would actually make sure that those events also get through into EventBridge.
Yep.
Scott Piper also brought up, I see you brought up the put metric data. I did find out that you can get data level CloudTrail for DynamoDB.
And S3.
If you want it.
S3, yeah. You do data level events.
So certain things you can get.
They very quickly become extraordinarily expensive to do.
Yep. We wanted to do some certain things, and actually we still do, where we just turn it on for a couple of days because we want to ensure that all of our data access is only with like tenant scoped keys. So turn them on, and then basically immediately after they're turned on, just like go back to AWS and say, please turn them off. We just want a subset.
So talking about put metric data, and that's actually my favorite thing to do or to annoy people, is you can actually, if you use the CloudWatch metric data, put metric data, you can write to the AWS metrics. So you can actually you can create errors in Lambda or make errors disappear in Lambda by putting negative numbers in there and stuff like that. It's very fun to do.
One of the things that annoys me about SAM is that it gives you essentially starred access across the logs.
Yep.
When it doesn't need to, because you can wire in the name into the policy.
And there should be. That's annoying in two levels, because that also means that they're probably not creating the log group with CloudFormation, which also means that it's going to be super hard if you want to have retention on that.
That's
actually, if you want to,
true, but I think it's normal for Lambda to create its own log group.
I think that makes it easy for end users, but I believe that the log group itself should be created with CloudFormation.
Yep.
Yeah. Seems like,
CDK does this right.
A good best practice.
Yeah, I thought you could create it in CloudFormation, and then if Lambda matches it by name, so you could probably do that with SAM as well, right?
You can create it with you can create it if it's the first time you deploy it. So you can create a log group, but CloudFormation will complain, and it's the same with CDK. CloudFormation will complain if the log group already exists. So if you have a Lambda that you deployed first and then was triggered and it created its own log group, and then you go back and say, oh, actually, I don't want to keep that forever. I want to have like 14 days retention, and I want to manage that with CloudFormation. The only way to do that, by now you can import the log group into CloudFormation, so you don't have to delete it anymore, but you do have some manual access to do there to get it into CloudFormation.
And that's inherent in the CloudFormation resource provider spec. That part of the tests that will run is that if a create is called on a resource that already exists, that the resource provider has to fail. Which means that upsert APIs actually need to do a read before they call upsert to be compliant.
I deviated from that every once in a while, just out of convenience.
Yep.
And that's why you're pointing it out, isn't it? No.
No, because I've had these questions about various things before. And with, way back with Ryan Lohan. Yeah, I mean, it's just part of the way that everything needs to work identically.
I think this world would be a slightly better place if CloudFormation would be less rigid. Well, that's a loaded statement, isn't it? Yeah.
I'm rigid in which way? Rigid in a way because I was actually going to say that I think it's a good thing that they made all those assumptions that you had to figure out yourself with the custom resources, like the fact that if you do an update and you replace your physical resource ID, then it will call the delete for you. That are all things you had to figure out yourself. Making all those things explicit and part of the contract test, I think is a good idea. So making it more rigid in that regard, I think is a good thing. So I'm curious which places you would make more flexible there.
So this was a while back, but I think it was especially around things that you would typically do with APIs or would come configured by default. And if you would want to create a resource provider for that, and you would like to really stick to CRUD operations, then by using the resource you create, you would actually require the user of the resource to first go into the CLI, delete something before they're even able to create a resource for CloudFormation, and that doesn't seem like that doesn't seem like a good experience. You can't tell that to people. Like, use this new thing, but then first going to the CLI to take something out before you can deploy. And there was things that I remember that like resources that are hosted by AWS that go exist like cross-region. I don't know the specifics, but imagine managing, because CloudFormation is regional, and then you have this way you think about these resources and how they're managed by CloudFormation, and then if you create the same resource from within two different regions, then that ends up being a weird thing as well.
Yeah, ACM and CloudFront make cross-regional things like that also very complicated with CloudFormation, where in some cases it can access global services, and in some cases it cannot create the dependencies for those global services. So that's definitely a tricky thing to get right.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong. So everything behaving the same way is a very important thing, and it's very valuable in itself. But it's just that there's with a couple of these things, there's very like a long or steep learning curve.
I actually completely agree with the problems that you're pointing out there. I just think that the solution is a bit different. I think they should make the import better. And if you're trying to create something that already exists, you could get a prompt that just asks, hey, we already created this one, and it's not managed by CloudFormation right now. Do you want to take this into CloudFormation management? And that would actually solve that whole first experience problem where there's something might already exist that you created beforehand, or even words that was created by the console behind the scenes that you didn't know about, like a service role or things like that. Being able to then say, now this is my canonical place to manage that without having to tear everything else apart, I think would be a very good user experience there.
Yeah, but it will be interactive, right? And
yes.
And personally, yes. I'm not. Yeah, just like to be able to deploy something and.
Well, and I think there are two things that get me. One is what I'm looking for is not more flexibility, but more expressiveness, right? I want what I'm expressing to be rigidly defined. I just want to be able to do more things, right? So I want a way to have something like stack sets, but with heterogeneous stacks in them. So I can say this thing has to go in someplace else, which is, essentially the CDK is doing a lot of these things, right? With CDK apps, right? Our collections of stacks. My problem with it is that it exists only client side, right? I want these things to be fully represented in the cloud so that AWS understands them as well, not just me. And I can, I get all of the benefits of having a managed service that owns these multi-stack things, all of that kind of stuff.
Technically, you could write a lot of conditions if you want, different stacks and different accounts.
It's true. But the other piece then is, I think there's an inherent problem that I've run into, that I've seen people run into, is that when we look at CI/CD and we look at GitOps, it doesn't take into account one-time operations. So you have a source code definition that defines your resource graph, and you have a pipeline that says, I'm going to go make this resource graph a reality. And you have a service that says, I'll take a resource graph, whatever the existing state is, I can move it there. So great, I want to roll back. I can point back at the previous commit, and it will go back to the graph definition that was in the previous commit. That's all great, but now when I need to do an operation as part of the move from commit A to commit B, and I then need to apply some, say, data migration, how do I indicate that in a way that is not tied? So if I roll back, right, what's going to happen, right? And now even if you're in a situation where you can say, all right, well, I know that if I'm rolling back, it's still going to support because I've done sort of the backwards compatibility work. You still have this situation of, okay, well, so then when you go forward again, how do you not again run that script, or do run that script again? And I've seen someone who sort of thought of the infrastructure problem in event sourcing terms. So to say, all right, I'm going to define, instead of defining a sequence of resource graphs as my infrastructure definitions over time, I'm going to define a sequence of change sets. And I think it's a really interesting way of looking at it, although you run into this problem of your rollback is now only roll forward and may require you to, on the fly, invent a new change set.
I was going to ask, do you actually want to write those change sets yourself? Because that would also, I think you will have to give up some of the ways that you're writing these things declaratively right now.
Suppose you had a way of defining those change sets declaratively, right? To say, add this Lambda function with these connections, right? Like imagine, that doesn't exist today, but imagine that it did.
Sure, and are we seeing this as like every change set being a small change, or can it be a big thing, and do those have to be atomic or not?
Well, I don't know. That's I think that's part of the question. The other thing you get into is, all right, great, something got into a bad state. How do you tear everything down? And event sourcing says, all right, great, you got to start from the beginning and run the entire event stream. And so now you're waiting for 3 years of updates to happen because you tore down your dev stack and stood it back up. You also, drift detection becomes difficult, right? So I don't think it's a solution, but it's an interesting approach to solving that problem, because we don't really have a good solution on the other side, the sequence of definitions, right? Sequence of states. And does anyone here have experience with doing that in a principled way? You can always have someplace where you're tracking it and then you run those manually, or you have something, but I haven't ever encountered something that says, here's a framework for a rigorous framework for understanding how that should work, not necessarily tied to any given process or tool.
So I do not, and that's that's not the useful answer to your question. I'm going to be one of those people in the forums that says, no, I don't. But does this talk to a problem that I have? Shut me down quickly if it doesn't. That it's the circular dependency stuff in a single template, where I'd like to be able to say, create my bucket, then I'd like to be able to say, do something else. Then I'd like to be able to say, update my bucket definition now because I've got something else. You can't do that in CloudFormation. Shouldn't you be able to do that in CloudFormation? And have I just derailed the conversation? If I have, tell me so.
No, I think, so in general, that may need to be split into multiple updates to be accomplished, which doesn't mean it's not impossible, it's inconvenient.
Yeah.
And it goes, I think, more towards CloudFormation resource design, which says you should design resources in a way such that circular dependencies are never necessary.
To technically answer your question, should you be able to do that? Yes, but the implementation on the AWS side doesn't always allow that.
Well, no, I think the answer to should you be able to create circular references and have CloudFormation resolve them by a multi-stage update is probably no, because I think you probably end up in situations where you're getting surprised.
Yeah. Yes. Okay. I heard the question as I have these things that need to actually be tied together in a certain way. And currently I cannot do that in CloudFormation in one deploy. Should I be able to deploy everything in one go? And I think the answer to that question should be yes. In an ideal world, you can have your final state in a template and you should be able to deploy that all at once. And CloudFormation should be able to figure out how that works. That doesn't necessarily mean, like you said, that you can define it exactly the same way that you would whiteboard it, where you might have circles. You might have to do some tricks there, like you have to do with security groups that can have rules as a separate resource. But it should, in an ideal world, it would be possible to write a template like that.
And so an example of this is CloudFormation bucket notifications, where the bucket notification configuration is part of the S3 bucket resource.
This is exactly the thing I was thinking of, so yes.
And the problem there is if you want to notify a Lambda function, any notification requires that the notified thing, whether it's a Lambda function, an SNS topic, or an SQSQ, needs to have a policy, a resource policy, that allows the bucket to send that notification to that destination. And so that resource policy needs to reference the bucket. However, the way that S3 bucket configuration works is that at creation time, it makes a check against the permissions. So even though no notifications are being sent out, it checks, does the permission exist for this notification to work right now? And because that's part of the bucket resource, it's created when the bucket is created. So the bucket is created, and then after that, the notification configuration is put on it. But that is before, because it's all one resource, that's before the name of the bucket is available to any other resource in CloudFormation, because the resource is not done creating. So the notification configuration, which has the Lambda ARN in it, says, does S3 have permission to invoke that Lambda? No, because the Lambda resource policy is waiting for the bucket name to come after the bucket resource is done creating. So it refuses to create. This is solved in a couple of different ways. One is that you hard code the bucket name in. And so the resource policy doesn't actually have a direct reference to the bucket name. It has the bucket name hard coded into it, and the bucket name is hard coded into the bucket. And so the bucket name is available before the resource exists. That's a bad situation. You never want to manually name resources when you don't have to. The other solution, which is what Sam does, is make the resource policy on the Lambda allow any bucket to invoke that Lambda, which is also not good. What you really want is that the bucket resource, or the bucket notification resource, is a separate resource from the bucket.
Yep.
Because then the bucket exists, then the Lambda gets the name of the bucket, and the Lambda resource policy exists. And then the notification configuration gets the Lambda ARN and receives the, and then gets put on the bucket, and all the permissions exist in the right order.
Yes, that's exactly the use case that I had in mind, and that's and the statically named bucket is exactly the solution that I use at the moment. But absolutely, that's the last thing that you want to have named statically is an S3 bucket with globally unique names. But yeah, but the thing is, you start to take out too many things from a resource definition to make them, all tiny little resource definitions, and then you're going to have backlash the other way, saying I have to do too much work to make something simple happen. But is there a way? Obviously, there is not a way currently. But what about a way where we have within a single template the notion of I'm going to be in control of the order these things are applied in? Maybe it could be done automatically as it is now. But essentially, I have mini stack updates, mini update steps inside of the actual template itself. So you could say, here's my definition of the bucket that I want at the beginning. And now you've gone and created some resources. Here's the definition of the bucket I now want to have. Figure out a change to that.
I think there's no way that you could do that you wouldn't end up being surprised sometimes.
Sure.
But I think that your remark about little resources actually can point to some interesting things. Let's assume that we actually advocate for that and that we get that. Like everything is a resource. Every single thing that can be a separate API call is a resource. But on top of that, we get the resources that we have now as modules. So that we can either define them as a module, and in that way, we can still have the simple way to do it and have it in our concept as that's an S3 bucket with all its configuration in there. And then when you deploy that, CloudFormation will split that out behind the scenes into all the different things. And the moment that you run into this kind of circle dependencies, you can opt to go for the more difficult version and not define the thing that you want to create on that bucket module yourself, but just pull only that part out of it and then define that with a dependency somewhere else.
I mean, I don't think that should be the case for S3 buckets with the notifications, just because that's such a basic use case that you shouldn't push people to have to explode the module. It's an interesting idea, though.
Yeah, and you don't necessarily have to explode the full module, right? You can, if you don't define a certain thing, that's you can have a condition on that in the module, and you can define your own version of that.
Yep.
So it would also solve the problem that you now, for example, can have with security groups, where if you create a rule inside a security group and then create the same rule as a separate resource, that there's no way to, I think there's still no way to know which one was created. Like maybe at this point with the comments that you can put in there, you could make a distinction there between which resource is coming from where. But before you could have comments on security group rules, there was no way from CloudFormation to go back to that resource and know how it was created.
Yeah.
I'm going to jump off, folks, but it's been awesome.
Let's do Jared.
Yep. Later.
Appreciate it. Thank you. Well, I mean, yes, maybe we're coming towards the end of this anyway. Of how do people feel about that?
Yeah. All right with that.
Cool.
Sure. That's very nice hanging out.
Other questions people have?
Yeah.
Any other topics people want to discuss?
I had written down things about IP version 6, but it was not something that was very high in the priority list of things I wanted to talk about. But that was like the only thing that I was seeing over the last few months, that there was a lot of things coming around that.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like AWS, the eventual sea change that will be necessary for IPv6 to take off, it feels like there's a significant role for AWS to play in that, right? That there are AWS services that understand IPv6, but you can't build like an IPv6 native system on AWS today. And once you can, that's maybe the tipping point.
I would like it because I have a lot of problems. I get a lot of questions when I do workshops, things like that, about which IP range should I pick for my VPCs, and not necessarily which range exactly, but how big should my VPC be?
Oh yeah.
And the question there is sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, putting like a corporate network connected VPC in every account. When you have hundreds of accounts, you start running out of subnets.
Yeah, and so you have two recommendations from AWS. Like one recommendation is pick big IP ranges. So pick at least a /24 for your subnets, and if you can, pick a /23 for your private subnets, because you'll have a lot of things in there. And the other recommendation is don't have any overlapping IP ranges. Yeah. Good luck with that if you have a limited set of IPs to choose from.
And or other networks that you're connected to.
Yeah, so in best case scenario, you can use like /16s and use like 256 accounts, and then you're done. In most cases, like a lot of that will be actually already used on premises, and then yeah.
Someday.
Someday. We actually. No, go ahead.
What I was going to suggest is that I would start to terminate the recording. We can all stay and have an after thing, but at some point we need to stop the recording.
Sure.
People, I don't know if we're going to do another one of these things. I hope we do. If you're interested in doing one of these things, then probably the best thing to do is to smash Ben on Twitter, because I think that's probably where the drive is going to come from. Thank you to Ben. Thank you to
Dead Ben or Dead Ben.
Oh yeah, actually, yeah. All the Bens, but Ben Kehoe probably primarily.
The thing I'm interested in hearing about is both frequency and times.
Yep.
So monthly is maybe a useful cadence, but if it's monthly at the same time every month, that's probably not useful to everyone in the world. And would it make sense to have every other week, but each of those every other weeks is aimed at a different time zone or set of people or whatever it is, kind of a thing? So
yeah,
any
that's a
given
good question.
Probably attending monthly, but there's availability, and we're not doing the whole thing all in one day.
And then the question I have is about technology and platform and whether Zoom works. It seems to, from my perspective. I'd be interested to know what other people think. It doesn't give people the opportunity to sort of just to observe live without participation. So that's a question, but I mean, people can follow up and watch it afterwards on the recording, so that's an opportunity too. But
if you think that would be interesting, I'm happy to look in that later offline, because I think there are definitely ways to have both, to stream out to Twitch or YouTube or things like that, and then still have the Zoom call available for people to hop into, so they can actually participate as well.
I've definitely seen this happen in live events.
Yeah.
But it seems complicated.
I just need to stress my processor out a little bit and just set up streaming to other places. I've seen it done too. So yeah, it can be done.
You end up then having to watch chat in different places and all that kind of stuff, right? But,
yeah. So anyway, anyone's got thoughts.
Yeah.
Cool. Something to think about.
I really like Zoom. This platform works well for this.
I definitely want people to be able to hop in and either video or just voice participate in the conversation, right? Or only through text if that's how they want. But I think it's important that it's not just the hosts as the only speakers or whatever.
For sure.
I think with this audience size, you can definitely manage multiple text-based platforms as well, if that would be the case, especially as a test, where you stream out to a certain place and then just make sure that one of the people in the call that is talking from time to time keeps an eye on one, that you either divide the platforms or keep an eye on the chat, and then can point out interesting conversations that are happening there.
Heck, if we in our community can't figure out how to scale, then we've
exactly
we should give up now. All right. Well, look, thanks everybody. I'll stop the recording there, and we can carry on. And for everybody else who's on YouTube and all the rest of it, we'll see you next time. Thanks.